Welcome. I'm Ron Baker. I'm the director of the Canadian Small Church Ministry Center, and this is us, Canadian Small Churches podcast, and we're in action. And so today, our action actually goes outside of Canada, down to the United States, and we have a special guest with us, another Ron, and the name is Ron. Oh, I'm not supposed to say that. I'm supposed to ask you, what's your name? And what has been your ministry journey over this last while?
Well, thank you, Ron. Thank you for the important work that you're doing for just to raise the profile of small church ministry. Yeah, my name is your name, at least the first name, Ron. Mm-hmm. So happy that I can remember your name that way.
We're both in good shape today for this podcast.
My last name is Klassen, Ron Klassen, and probably the important thing about that is that all of my Klassen relatives live in Canada.
Oh.
So you might be thinking you're going outside of Canada, and in a sense you are, but actually my dad was raised in Canada. He was a Canadian till he was 30 and was raised, or actually his family homesteaded on a farm north of Saskatoon. A little town called Rabbit Lake.
I know Rabbit Lake. Yeah.
So I feel at home in Canada. I've traveled across Canada from my young years as a boy, and even now during my years in ministry. So very pleased and happy for my Canadian heritage.
Well, before you go too much further, this is just one of these things that I do on this podcast every once in a while. You're probably related to me because I married a Workington from just north of Saskatoon as well. And there's this whole Mennonite background that she has. And, okay, so we're probably related. Let's keep going.
Yeah, I don't know how far down that road you want to go.
I don't know. It's a rabbit trail for sure, but let's keep going.
So in spite of all of what I've just said, most of my growing up years were spent in Phoenix, Arizona, and in large church. Went from there to Dallas to seminary. So you're looking here at mostly an urban large church guy who woke up one day and found himself in rural ministry and in a small church. And it was certainly not Ron Klassen's wonderful plan for his life. But it was God's plan, and it's proven to be a wonderful plan. And I look back on my life with a sense of gratitude and privilege. So what happened to me was what happens to many students. I didn't know it at the time, but you reach those months right before graduation. You start looking at opportunities for ministry. You're thinking maybe you're going to end up number 3, number 4 on a large church staff. You find that those opportunities are limited, and you find yourself instead in small church and often smaller community kind of ministry, which happens, statistics show up to even 75% of new grads who are looking for pastorates will find themselves in smaller communities and churches. And that was what happened to us. We ended up in rural Nebraska, and thinking we were in moral utopia, thinking that, the cities are where sin is, and the rural communities are kind of like Mayberry.
The corn huskers were the best thing in the world. Yeah, and all that sort of stuff. Yeah.
Yeah, we caught the corn husker bug while we were there. We still have that bug. But just as we were there, the Lord opened our eyes to the spiritual needs in rural places, and simultaneously just gave us a real love for the people that he had entrusted to us. And over time, we grew in our love and appreciation for rural people and places. And at the same time, our eyes were continuously open to just the vast needs. At first, Roxy and I, my wife and I, would say, somebody ought to do something. and we're still thinking we're eventually heading to the city here, back to what we're familiar with. But at some point along the way, we started to say, maybe we ought to be two of those somebodies that God uses in rural ministry. And we've committed now a lifetime to rural ministry. And as I said, we look back with a lot of gratitude because we recognize that it's something that God did in us and not something that was a part of our plan.
Now, right now, you're helping to head up part of the heading up of Rural Home Missionary Association, RHMA. How's that?
Yeah.
What?
Well,
What
RHMA, as you can tell by looking on your screen, stands for Really Handsome Men's Association.
I'm all for it. We're good.
Yeah, Ron, you can join us here. No, it stands for Rural Home Missionary Association. Our mission is to plant and strengthen churches in small towns. We have a staff of church planters. Here in recent months, even years, we've actually started some new initiatives in the area of church planting, recognizing that we need to kind of reinforce that part of our ministry. We have a number of church strengthening ministries, which would include sending a missionary pastor to a church that, for who knows what reasons, churches for a variety of reasons find themselves in the need of an outside organization coming alongside them for a while, helping to get back on their feet again. And we have a staff of missionary pastors that go to churches like that, and we try to help them here from the home office, provide the support and counsel that they need. And then we have a whole array of other church strengthening kinds of ministries. We host small town pastors conferences. We host seminars that are tailored for town and country ministry. We host what we call our TACT classes, town and country training.
Oh.
These are seminary classes. We are in partnerships with a number of seminaries. We offer this specialized, contextualized training for all those new grads that are likely to find themselves in smaller communities and smaller churches. And one of our most recent undertakings has been to lead a small town and rural pastors doctor of ministry cohort, which we're doing in partnership with Dallas Seminary. And that's been a really fun venture. As far as I know, it's the only DMin cohort in the US for rural and small town pastors, and have just really enjoyed that experience.
I wouldn't doubt that. Here's a question for you. I understand you recently taught a class just in this last short while. If you were to look around the group that were there preparing for ministry, what would were they all excited about small church ministry? What was your take on that whole bit of, we want to go into ministry? So
yeah, I think you're talking here about our master's level classes, made up of probably half of the students in our TACT classes are in seminary, have never have very little, if any, kind of ministry experience, much less rural pastoral ministry or small church experience. The other half are kind of a mixture. Some of them have been in ministry, maybe rural ministry, for maybe a couple of years, and they realize they need to kind of sharpen some of their skills. Some of them have been in ministry for 20 years, and they recognize, it would probably be a good thing for me to kind of sharpen my skills as well. And then we sometimes have district minister kinds of people, people who oversee perhaps a number of rural pastors, and maybe that's not their background and they want to have a better understanding of rural church ministry, so they'll take our classes as well. But of that half of our classes, typical classes that are seminary students, we have some that are bullish about it. They are excited. They are ready to go. We have the other side of the spectrum where they're just kind of curious. They're kind of hearing that this might be where they end up, and maybe they ought to take a class and just kind of figure out if it's something that they feel like they can do. So there's really kind of the whole spectrum, but we have a lot of fun in our classes, and we feature a lot of cultural immersion experiences that help to orientate especially our city guys who think they might end up in rural ministry.
Okay, this cultural immersion thing. What kind of exercises do you do for that? I have a guess, but
yeah, we have a variety of ways where our students can rub shoulders with rural people. Some of them come to us in the classroom. So different kinds of rural people. It might be a mayor of a small town. It might be a school superintendent. It might be somebody in law enforcement, like a deputy sheriff or something like that. And then we also get our students out, and we expose them to different facets of rural places, which could include small businesses. It could include different kinds of farm operations, from dairy farm to grain farm to hog farms and the like. So we just want them to rub shoulders and get acquainted with rural people and rural places. And it gets really interesting sometimes. One year we're on a dairy farm, and there was actually a calf being born right when we were there.
Oh, excellent.
Our students were like, well, thank you for doing this for us. It's like, well, we can't exactly plan this, but this is pretty exciting.
Yeah.
All right, we have a lot of international students that actually take our classes, and some of them are going back to their country, and they know that they're going to be either working in rural ministry, or some of them are going to be teaching in Bible colleges, and they know that most of their students are going to be rural. And so we get a lot of those students, and thankfully our classes will translate over into other countries. But I say that as background. We've had some of our students, we've gone to an implement dealership, and they'll point to something and they'll say, so what is that? And it may be a massive tractor.
Yeah.
So some of our students don't even know what a tractor is. And
okay.
Another student, I remember one year, pointed to another piece of equipment, and it was a combine. And he said, well, what is that? I don't know what that is. So we have a whole spectrum of students who've actually grown up in rural places. They're comfortable in rural culture, to students who have virtually no exposure whatsoever to rural places or people.
Okay. So we've got this wide variety of people, and I mean, urban settings tend to be quite different than rural settings. But how would you characterize the difference? Well, let's talk about church. You know, the difference between usually an urban church and a rural church. I'll let you just run with that one. See.
Yeah, I experienced a lot of that difference when I went from a city church to a rural context, and much to my regret, I spent a couple of years, I think, trying to make my rural church into a city church, which was kind of an exercise in futility. I simply did not realize that rural is cross-cultural, and that even going from big church to small church, you're dealing with two different church cultures. And I think it's really important for us to understand that there are those cultural differences, even here in our own country, whether it's the US or Canada. If you're going from one place to another, there's going to be cultural differences. As it relates to the church, I think, yes, it's very, very important that we don't try to copy and paste what we see happening in larger population areas. Contextualization is a drum that we beat over and over and over again. It's just really, really important. Just because something works in a city church or in a big church doesn't mean that it's going to work in a rural community or a small church. And unfortunately, a lot of training of pastors is done from a big city, big church kind of orientation. And it's not always, it's just not always very applicable to our kinds of settings. That doesn't mean that big churches are bad. I'm
No.
very thankful for my big church that I grew up in. I am indebted for all of eternity to my big church background.
Hmm.
And it doesn't mean that the way they do things is wrong, maybe for their context, but it could be very difficult to cut and paste or copy and paste that and put that into a rural context. I would say that a big difference with rural and probably even most small church ministries, even in larger contexts, if it's a small church, is that in urban places, I think churches probably put a lot more emphasis on things like programs and buildings and vision statements and the like. If you ask a big church person, well, what do you appreciate about your church? Well, they'll talk about the 3 different services that they have, the recent building program that they went through, the wonderful youth ministry that happens on, Sunday night, whatever. Rural church and small church people don't usually tend to talk that way.
No.
You ask them what they appreciate, and they'll talk about the relationships in their church. They'll talk about how their pastor knows them by name.
Yeah.
And how when they're in the hospital, their pastor comes and visits them. So that relational orientation, I think, is just really key.
Potlucks are the most important thing that you can have in a small church.
Yeah, and I think we can build on that. I think God uses different personalities. He uses different approaches to ministry, and that's true in rural places, just like it might be in larger places. But I think one commonality that is super important, probably in any rural context and probably most any small church context, is that the pastor kind of leads the way with the relational orientation in his ministry. And I think that if we as pastors have healthy relationships with our people, that makes our preaching more effective. I think they will listen to our preaching, even if our preaching maybe isn't, the kind of preaching that maybe a big pastor is able to do. And let's face it, most of us can't preach like most big church pastors. We just don't have that ability. But I would suggest that our preaching can have every bit as much impact if we have a healthy relational orientation with our congregation. They will want to listen to us as preachers. It means they'll follow us as leaders in our churches. If we don't have that healthy relational orientation, we might have great ideas, we might have great leadership skills, but we may look behind us and not see anybody's following us because we don't have that healthy relational orientation. We might have buy-in to vision. I think vision can be important in a small church and in a rural context, but in order for our people to have buy-in, that relational health between the leader and the congregation is incredibly important. And I think if we're looked to for, if there are situations where counsel, advice is needed, again, we may not have tremendous counseling skills, but if we have a healthy relational dynamic with the people in our congregation, we will be able to help them through all kinds of issues of life that they might be facing. So I think that's the primary difference. If you're in a big church, you don't expect the pastor probably even to know your name.
Yeah.
He pops out on Sunday morning, he preaches, and but he doesn't really shepherd people in the same way that you can when you know your sheep in a small church and smaller community kind of context.
I find it encouraging to hear what RHMA is doing as far as pulling together smaller churches in association. How do you connect? How do you bring people into the association? I suppose part of it is you're planting churches, but also the helping efforts and that type of thing, strengthening. What are you guys doing with that?
Well, because we're not affiliated with any particular denomination or other entity, we're not anti-denominational, by the
No.
way, but we aren't affiliated formally. I think that gives us an entree into a lot of places. It brings people our way to serve as church planters and missionary pastors from different church denominations and backgrounds.
Mm-hmm.
So people come to us in a variety of different ways. Our staff have some diversity from where they went to school to their church backgrounds and such. And then, of course, like our conferences and seminars, we have pastors attending from 20 to 25 different denominations. Similarly, with students in our classes, there's a variety of backgrounds. So we're able to minister fairly broadly, still within an evangelical kind of framework. We have a doctrinal statement, which you can find on our website. So we're not quite all things to all people, but yet we do have, I think, a healthy diversity of people and churches that we minister to and that are part of our ministry organization.
Yeah, I find it interesting that the association's been going since 1942, and oftentimes what happens with associations and societies, they morph into a large institution or denomination, but yet you're still able to keep that sort of bringing people together efforts, and that always interests me as to how you maintain that over time.
Yeah, it's the grace of God.
Mm-hmm.
It's keeping the main things, and keeping other things not quite as central or as important. By God's grace, we have I would say a healthy unity among our RHMA staff, and likewise, just a real camaraderie that takes place with our conference and seminars and educational ministries. So just very thankful for that. That's, again, the grace of God working, I think, in the people that he brings our way.
Yeah, I just encourage you with that, because that is a great gift that you guys are bringing to small churches, which of course is where I'm sort of focusing and looking at. Yeah, I think it's marvelous. Now, at the same time, the association does work with their own missionaries.
Yes.
What are you looking for in a missionary in a small church, rural church setting type of idea? I mean, they can't all join RHMA where we're all Ron, handsome Ron and all those. Yeah. So
yeah, you have to be handsome.
Okay.
So that's number one. I would say we look for several things. Some of these things we try to discern informally as we get acquainted with prospective staff members. And some we may just try to discern as we look at references. We always ask for a recommendation from a home church and those kinds of things. But certainly character matters. Having a evangelical framework with belief system and that sort of thing matters. But there's just a lot of personal qualities that I think are important. One, I think, is just having a wholesome attitude, kind of having the mind that Christ had when He came to earth from heaven. Imagine the transition that was for him. Surely that was a wider gulf to cross than any gulf from city to small town in the US or Canada. Christ was not condescending in how he spoke to people. He loved people. He accepted people as they were. He avoided an attitude of superiority or arrogance, that sort of thing. So just having that kind of an attitude, I would say, is incredibly important. If I could describe it in a sentence, I would want to quote one of our RHMA church planters from years ago. He moved from the Pacific Northwest, beautiful Pacific Northwest, mountains, forests, green, water, to the Arizona desert, to a very desolate small town in Arizona. And he and his wife decided, and they were intentional about this. He said, we decided that we were going to like this place, even if we didn't. And I think that's the kind of attitude that we do well to bring with us if we're going to a place that God is calling us to. And don't be surprised if after a while you find out that you do like the place.
Yeah, exactly.
You may actually fall in love with the place. I think another quality is just simply the adaptability. I think of the Apostle Paul saying that he became a Jew when he was with Jews. He became a Gentile when he was with Gentiles. So it's not an attempt to make people become like me, but it's actually me recognizing that I need to work at becoming like the people that God is wanting me to serve and minister to. And I've got a whole slew of examples of how that had to happen with Roxy and me as we were city slickers moving to rural places. But I just think that willingness to be adaptable is very important, especially for the 50% or so of new rural pastors who are not from rural backgrounds. They're probably not going to survive in rural ministry if they're not willing to approach it like a missionary, recognizing that there are cultural differences. And when we go to a culture, we can't expect that culture to become like us. We have to become like that culture. And then I would say also maybe just a willingness to sacrifice, a willingness to give up some things. We've already mentioned culture, giving up our culture, maybe giving up familiar food, giving up how we dress, maybe giving up a good salary, giving up maybe some amenities that we're used to having close by, like even a simple thing like Walmart.
Yeah.
We might be a couple of hours from a Walmart. Starbucks, good luck trying to find that out in a rural place. So just that willingness to give up and having a good attitude about having to give up, I think is really important. And again, I would like to say, don't be surprised if you find out that you gain a lot more than you lose. When you go to a rural community. I don't think we ought to go with that attitude of, well, God, I'm going to give up. I'm going to give. And so you owe me, you need to give me back, I'm not saying that this is, let's make a deal with God, but I do think that inevitably, we will find that we gain a lot of things if we move to a place where we realize that we have to give up. So those two sometimes work together. And then, of course, just the importance of teachability. Some pastors, I think, and I would probably include myself in the group, felt that I learned everything I needed to know about ministry and seminary. Yeah. And so I show up in my first place and I kind of have this attitude of, wow, aren't you fortunate that you've got me as your pastor? I have a master's degree in theology. I've been trained in how to do ministry, and here I am. So let me teach you. I found out that there's a lot to learn post-seminary, and that
Yes.
in fact, the learning curve might be higher after you enter ministry. And I just, one of the things I get so excited about teaching on the deep doctor of ministry level is that I'm working with some students that realize that learning is a lifelong uh, uh,
Adventure,
something
really.
that we should
Yeah.
do forever.
Yeah.
It's not something that it's done at any certain point. So just being teachable and maintaining that through all of our years of ministry is just, I think, incredibly important.
Yeah. I can see we could go on and on here. This is just getting started. And unfortunately, we're about at the end already. So,
Wow.
yeah. So I'm going to leave with one last question. I'm not sure what your answer will be or how it will shape out, but if you were to reach across the border to Canadian rural small churches and just say, here's one thing that I'd like to say to Canadian small churches today, what would that be?
Oh, wow. I will say that what has helped me maybe more than anything else in ministry to small places and small churches
Mhm.
is developing a robust small theology. How does that sound?
I like small theology.
uh, I borrow that phrase from a fellow by the name of David Ray. He wrote years ago a book on, or actually 2 or 3 books on small church ministry.
Mhm.
Basically, what I'm talking about is a theology for ministry in smaller
Yeah.
places.
Yeah.
And the Bible has a lot to say about small. And I think it could be helpful if we read our Bible through small town, small church, whatever context we find ourselves, through those lenses. And we will be encouraged. We will be validated in our ministry. We will be equipped in so many ways. And we will be much more willing and to persevere in the ministry that God has entrusted to us. There's so many wonderful passages, anything from the story of Gideon showing us that we don't have to have all kinds of resources to be effective, to the smaller temple, post-exilic temple in Zechariah 4 that God tells, or Zechariah tells the people, don't despise this smaller temple.
Yeah.
Don't look down, thinking it's inferior to the bigger temple. To the New Testament, where our Lord himself was largely a rural minister and spent virtually all of his ministry in rural, out of the way kinds of places. Some of his teaching can certainly impact us, such as the importance of that one lost sheep way out in the country that we spent all kinds of time looking for, all kinds of effort. To Colossians, which was a small church in a small town and had a leader who was just given all kinds of accolades by the Apostle Paul. On and on you could go. There's just so much there. And I think if we devote our lives to developing a small theology, that will take us a long way in rural and small church ministry.
Wow. That's the next dissertation that needs to be written, or maybe new book or whatever. But yes, I think that's fantastic. That's a great idea.
The funnest class that I've taught in our ministry, doctor of ministry program was asking students to contribute to a small theology. So take a text and help it contribute to a bigger small theology. And it was so fun. The students wrote the papers and then they presented in class, and we had some of the best time with that. And I think some of the most encouraging times that I've had in any classes through all my years of teaching. So it
Oh,
was a
that's
experience.
fantastic.
Yeah.
Well, I really do have to shut us down here, but I mean, we could keep going. So maybe we'll have to do that another day, but
That'd be
thank
great.
you. Thank you
Yeah.
very much.
Well, thank you, and wish you the best, and in the ministry that you have there, a very important ministry.
Thank you.